This is a nuclear war that can manifest in July or August of 2028. I've seen the mushroom clouds. I think it's a foregone conclusion that Russia is going to be involved in this, just because of the geopolitics. One of the visions I had shows an opposing army with these military hats that have very high fronts on them. And the Soviet or Russia has these types of hats. North Korea has these types of hats. China also has these types of hats. So one of those three nations will be involved in this. My advice for humanity is that the world leaders have got to take this threat of nuclear war seriously, and they've got to immediately start talks about nuclear disarmament. Today, the topic is what is prophecy and the science behind prophecy. What are the architecture of human consciousness that allows for prophecy? And prophecy is nothing new. Prophecy is something very ancient. People have experienced this throughout the ages. They experience it now today. This phenomena of precognitive awareness has become a standard, a normal part of my consciousness. I experience precognitive awareness almost every day, maybe not every single day, but it's a normal part of my consciousness. And these precognitive awarenesses manifest in me in different ways. Sometimes they manifest in visions that I have with when I'm meditating. When I go into a deep state of meditation, sometimes they come to me when I'm sleeping. But I also have other awarenesses that take place throughout the day that involve sounds that I hear. For those who stay with the video and listen to it to the end, I also want to share with anyone who's watching this video a prophecy that I've been made aware of involving a future event that will happen in the world in the not too distant future. I'll share with you a general time frame, a month and a year that this will occur. And this is an event that will affect everyone's life in the world to a greater or lesser extent, depending on certain factors. I will share some stories of my own mystical experiences with respect to foreknowledge of future events and prophecies. I will also explain and share some of the stories of prophecies and foreknowledge of future events from other mystics that I've been personally associated with. I also want to bring Carl Jung into the session today and discuss Carl Jung because he had his own mystical experiences with prophecy. He also had quite an extraordinary near-death experience, so I also want to talk about that. But his psychology and his insight into human consciousness is very important in understanding the architecture and the mechanics behind foretelling of future events. So I want to start off by just sharing a story about a mystic that I was associated with some years ago, who had the ability to foretell future events, and my experience with him. His name was Dr. Duque, Herman Duque. He was actually Colombian. He's no longer alive. But I met Dr. Duque in the late 1980s. I flew to Houston to meet with him. He flew around the world to meet with, patients and other mystics that he was associated with. Dr. Duque was also a disciple of my spiritual teacher, Kirpal Singh. Dr. Duque was a medical doctor who was actually trained in Germany, but he was a Colombian. And he had the ability to foresee the causes of diseases and illnesses that people would have in the future. And he did this without doing physical examinations of people. He did this by looking within his own consciousness, and he was able to see these things. So in my case, I met with him in a hotel room in Houston, and we sat in chairs. He didn't examine me physically at all. And he looked inside. He had a kind of a method of looking and seeing within his own consciousness. He was able to see into the causal plane. which we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail. But he was able to see in the causal plane of each one of his patients and see future diseases that they were, scheduled to have through their karma. And he was able to, once he saw the disease that the person was scheduled to experience, then he was able to apply certain prescriptions, certain medications, certain other factors so that this patient could avoid that disease. In my case, he said, in your throat, you have some tissue that's there. It's inflamed. And this is going to lead to cancer, to throat cancer. So you need to go to a surgeon and have this removed. So I did that when I got home. I went to an ear, nose, and throat doctor, and I explained to him that I had gone to another doctor. I didn't explain how Dr. Duque diagnosed me, but I told him that Dr. Duque said I have some tissue in my throat that needs to be removed. And I had throat problems throughout my whole life, really, different types of throat infections and things like that. So the doctor examined me physically, and he said, yes, you have some tissue in there. It is inflamed. He said, this is the result of having my tonsils removed when I was a young person. And they call it a tonsil tag. Sometimes when they remove the tonsils, there's a little bit of tissue left over. And the doctor said, yes, I can remove it for you. I can remove it with a laser. He also said, I thought was quite interesting, he said that we usually wait until these things actually develop into cancer before we remove them. And I said, well, I just assume have it removed now. And so he did remove it. And in that way, I was able to avoid any future problems with my throat. In the case of Dr. Duque, he also gave me another piece of advice that I left the room and I went out into the other room of the hotel in his suite, and he met with his wife, whose name was Graciela, and Graciela came out with another prescription for me, and I didn't realize the importance of what she said to me. Unfortunately, I thought that I was going to get some advice on, medical factors with respect to my physical health, but she came out with some other advice that had to do with my personal life. And this was a prescription for me. This was a gift that Dr. Duque gave to me. And I didn't realize how important and how valuable this was at the time. But I did not follow the advice and the prescription about my personal life that Dr. Duque had given to me. And as a result, I suffered greatly in later years as a result of not following this advice. As long as we're doing a little storytelling here, I want to go in right away to Carl Jung, because Carl Jung will come back. I'll be discussing him again in the session today. But Carl Jung had a very interesting experience in 1913, before the advent of World War I. And he was traveling on a train in Switzerland to visit some family. And I actually have some details about this visionary experience. This was prophecy. As I said, he was traveling on a train in Switzerland to see some family. And he had this vision. He was actually conscious at the time. He wasn't asleep or anything like that, but this just happened spontaneously to him. And what he saw was a massive flood that covered all of the land between the Alps and the North Sea. And this was the area of Europe where World War I was fought. And he associated this enormous flood with a huge catastrophe, and the floodwaters turned to blood. And he saw thousands of bodies drowning in this massive flood of blood. And he also then saw the Alps and Switzerland rising above the rest of Europe to avoid these floodwaters. So that was a prophetic experience that he had. He didn't ever really explore precognitive awarenesses or prophecies within the context of his own psychological premises, but he did discuss the causal plane, or what he called the collective unconscious, in future events. As long as we're on to Carl Jung, I want to also talk about his near-death experience, which is quite profound. And I know AJ kind of focuses and specializes on near-death experiences, and these are very profound experiences that people have. And they usually have them in the context of being in a life or death situation with some sort of medical problem or whatever. So in 1944, Carl Jung was 69 years old, and he went to the hospital with a broken foot, and he was convalescing in the hospital with a broken foot. While he was convalescing in the hospital, he had a heart attack. And in the context of the heart attack, he was taken out of his body, and he had a near-death experience. And he describes floating above the earth, and he was told that he was going to visit a meteorite where he would learn the true meaning, he would discover the true meaning of his life. But then suddenly he was called back into his body by the spirit and the voice of his doctor. So then over the course of the next couple of days, Carl Jung had a series of very profound out-of-body mystical experiences where he experienced samadhi. Samadhi is a state of consciousness where the spirit has risen completely above mind and matter and is in its own true pristine state without being wrapped by the mental planes. The Indians call these wrappings around the soul the koshas, and there's 5 different main koshas. But when a soul experiences samadhi, he's in his true spiritual home, and he's not wrapped by these koshas anymore, these mental wrappings. So Jung, and I have his words. I want to read his words directly the way he wrote them, because he spent a whole chapter in one of his books discussing this experience. And he said, this was not a product of imagination. The visions and experiences were utterly real. There was nothing subjective about them. They all had a quality of absolute objectivity. Then he goes on to say, it was as if I was in an ecstasy, filled with the highest possible feeling of happiness. Everything around me seemed enchanted, and there was a spirit of inexpressible sanctity in the hospital room, which had a magical atmosphere. Then he goes on to say, I floated in a state of purest bliss, thronged round with images of all creation. Again, he goes on, it is impossible to convey the beauty and intensity of emotion during those visions. This cannot be described. It is far too wonderful. And then he concludes in one section, we shy away from the word eternal, but I can describe the experience only as the ecstasy of a non-temporal state in which present, past, and future are one. Everything that happens in time has been brought together into a concrete whole. Nothing was distributed over time, and nothing could be measured in temporal concepts. So he was in a timeless state, and this experience of samadhi is in a pure spiritual realm, and spirit is not affected by time. When we're when we're wrapped by these mental planes, these mental spheres of consciousness, we are affected by time, because time exists in the mind, whether we're talking about our personal consciousness, our personal unconsciousness, or whether we're talking about the collective unconscious. But once we're in a purely spiritual state in samadhi, we don't experience time. I want to talk a little bit about me and my background and share some things I really have never shared, some of the things. But I think I've come to an age right now where it's time to share some of these things with other people. So in 1969, I started the spiritual path with my spiritual mentor. His name was Kirpal Singh. Kirpal Singh was a perfect master. Perfect masters are notable for many different things, but especially for 2 aspects. One is that a perfect master can leave the body at will and and traverse into the higher planes. Souls like Jesus and Buddha and Guru Nanak and Kabir and some of the great Sufi masters were able to do this. And there are, many souls who are able to do this who we don't know about. But he was able to do that. Another aspect of a perfect master is that they are able to work directly in the world, in the physical world, even after they depart the world, even after they leave their body for good. And in the case of Kirpal has many people who he worked through directly into the world. He is still working in the world directly through some of his disciples. I happen to be one of those, and all of us are getting older now. So Kirpal directly working in the world will be coming to an end at some point. In 1972, when I met with Kirpal, I traveled throughout the United States with him for several months. And I was in San Francisco at the Unitarian Church with a talk that he gave. And after the talk was over, I met with him actually for 3 nights after the talk was over. And during those encounters with him, his spirit entered my body and has always cohabited my body throughout my entire life. So when someone meets me, they meet one physical person, but they actually meet 2 souls. They meet my soul, but they also meet the soul of Kirpal. So Kirpal and his soul has been working within me and has been guiding me throughout my entire life. But I want to talk about the architecture of human consciousness and why prophecy and why having foreknowledge of future events is a normal part of human consciousness. The first thing to understand is the way that we look at the world is we look at it in a way that it doesn't really exist. We look at it wrongly. And the ancient rishis who wrote the Vedas, they said that the world is an illusion. Well, it's not really an illusion in the sense that we experience it. We're here, we have objects around us, we have a physical body. So it's not an illusion in the sense that it doesn't exist. It does exist, but it's an illusion in the way we think about it. It's an illusion in the way we understand it. If we just look at the atom and the way the atom's constructed, normally people think of the atom as being some sort of solid mass, some sort of solid, tiny, minuscule object. But the atom doesn't really have any material substance in the way we think of matter or the way we think of mass. The atom itself is mostly empty space. The particles, what we call particles in the atoms, are really only vibrations. They vibrate very, very fast. The nucleus of the atom rotates at a velocity that's 20% the speed of light. The electron that orbits the nucleus of the atom goes at something like 5% the speed of light. So it's these vibrations and this very fast velocities, speeds of these vibrations that create the illusion of mass. The other thing is that we have to understand in terms of our functioning in the world with physical objects is that the reason that, if the atom is empty space, why doesn't my hand go through the desk right now when I'm placing it on the desk in front of me? The reason for that is because of electromagnetism, because the atoms, the electrons that orbit all the atoms are all negatively charged. So a negatively charged table with its atoms, repels or rejects the negatively charged atoms of my hand and my body. So the atom is only made of vibrations and forces. So the way we look at the physical world, we look at it as being something different or something separate from the mind. But in fact, the physical world is just another aspect of mind. The physical world is a mental plane. Everything that we experience in the physical world, we experience mentally. We experience it in our minds, through our senses, through what we hear and see and feel and taste and touch. And so all of the experience that we have in here is psychological. So the earth plane is only another mental plane. So as Carl Jung very correctly recognized, he recognized that there was an unconscious, and that this unconscious, modern day psychologists might call it the subconscious. But Carl Jung saw that there was a personal unconscious and there was a collective, what he called a collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is very important in understanding what prophecy is and what foretelling future events is. So everything that happens in the physical world to people through their collective unconscious goes to the collective unconscious and is recorded there. And Easterners call this the causal plane. So in other words, everything that happens in the physical world first takes place in the causal plane, in the collective unconscious. Carl Jung understood that there was a memory in the collective unconscious. And he understood that this memory affected everything that the way we understand ourselves, things like belief systems, things like religions, things like cultural phenomena, all of the collective history of humanity is in this collective unconscious. The Easterners refer to this as the Akashic records. This is a memory, and this memory does affect how we view the world and our attitudes about things. Jung understood that there was a way that one culture thought about things, and there was a way that another culture thought about things, and there were differences. And he attributed this to this collective unconscious, and he did that very rightly, very correctly. There's another aspect of this causal plane or this collective unconscious that Jung never really understood, I guess, because he never wrote about it. And that is that events that happen that manifest in the physical world are all caused by thoughts, words, and deeds that take place in the world. And this isn't a memory, this isn't a psychic memory, collective memory. These are living entities that exist now in the causal plane. And so, in other words, every time we have a thought, or every time, especially a whole collection, a large group of people have a common thought, this creates these psychic entities in the causal plane. And these are living entities. They're living just as much as we are living in these physical bodies. These are actual living things that we create with our minds. In New Thought Church, there's a whole premise, important premise about our thoughts create our futures, and the more we focus on positive things, that we actually create our own futures. And they're absolutely right about this. This is completely true. Religions have understood the power of prayer for centuries. How important it is to pray to God, to have certain things. And this is the same process, that through prayer, we create these psychic entities, and these psychic entities come and help manifest in the world. So as far as prophecies and as far as the, major world events, the more the collective consciousness of humanity has common thoughts and common fears and common hopes about certain things, this creates these very powerful entities in the causal plane. Everything that happens in the physical world, that manifests in the physical world, is available to see in the causal plane before it manifests in the physical world. This is why Dr. Duque could see that I was headed for throat cancer if I didn't take care of this problem in my throat. So I want to get into this prophecy that I've been made aware of. But before I do that, I want to share another story, a very interesting story. Again, a story I haven't shared with very many people. There's not that many people who really know about this. And it has to do with another mystic that I was associated with in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s. And this mystic's name was Takar Singh. Takar was one of the successors to Kirpal Singh. He was one of the souls that Kirpal Singh worked through after Kirpal Singh left the physical world. He was one of many. But Takar lived in India, and he traveled all over the world teaching what my teacher taught, which is Shabd Yoga. And I met Takar first in, I believe it was 1980. He had been teaching Shabd Yoga, and he'd been traveling all over the world since about 1975. And I had some interesting visions and experiences with Takar when I first met him. One of the first time I met him was in California, and when I met him, the whole he was in a house where he was holding satsang and giving initiation and so forth. And walked in there, the whole house was completely enveloped in divine fragrances. And this is another experience I've had throughout the context of my life. So that was one of the ways that my teacher could kind of validate that Takar was a true mystic, that he radiated these incredible divine fragrances. So I met with Takar again periodically when he traveled. And in 1980, early 1983, he traveled to the US again. And during that tour, when he toured around the US, he started talking about destruction. He said, well, destruction is coming. And people didn't really understand what he meant by that. And I didn't understand what he meant. So I didn't pay that much attention to it. But then later on in 1983, in October of 1983, Takar sent me a communication, and he told me that I was to come to India. And I was working at the time. So it was a little difficult to come immediately, but I did make plans to go to India the following month in November. And as it turns out, during that period, I was having some visions about a war in an impending war. And by the way, the first vision I had about this was in 1972 when I was with Kirpal. And I had a vision of a big war coming in the future. And I spoke to Kirpal about this, and I also asked him if we have prophecies like this, if we can share with others. And he said, as long as I have corroboration on the inside with the inner master, that it was okay to share. So at any rate, so fast forward again to 1983, and I'm on my way to India. I've been called to India. It's early November. And something happened, and I don't remember what it was, but it delayed my plans to go to India for a month. So I wasn't able to actually fly to India until the following month, December. Before I went to India, I had a vision. And in the vision, I saw two moons side by side in the sky. And these two moons had rings around them, like the rings of Saturn. And there was a feeling of very intense peacefulness that was associated with this vision. It was a vision of peace with these two moons, with these rings around them. So I went ahead and I hopped on an Air India flight. I went to India. I didn't get there until December. And when I was picked up at the airport, I remember I was picked up by this Australian guy. And because he spoke English, I guess they sent him with a van to pick me up. And the first thing out of his mouth was, oh, this destruction is coming. And oh my God, Tucker's been talking about it. It could happen any time. And he's saying that he was telling me in the ride to the ashram through Delhi, he's telling me, oh my God, they've made all these plans. They've taken all the bank accounts and they've turned everything to gold. They've got a property. Takar has a property up in the hills in Dehradun, and he's put in these wells, and they planted fir trees, and they've made all these plans because this big destruction is coming. And so this is the first thing I hear when I get off the plane in India. So I get to the ashram, and sure enough, Takar's been talking about this. And that was a term that he used. He didn't describe it as a war. He didn't go into any detail. He just said that there's this huge, massive destruction that's coming. And I thought that, this is incredible. But the thing was that it did kind of correspond with the visions I had had. I'd had visions of mushroom clouds. I'd had visions of bombers taking off and things like that. And I had a personal meeting with Takar about this, a couple of personal meetings. And I explained to him what my visions were, and he said, yes, this is right. This is what's coming. And then at one point, and this was getting into late December, early January, I had another meeting with him, and I said, when is this going to happen? And he said, right now. I mean, that was his exact words. It's going to happen right now. I said, okay, well, this is unbelievable. This is amazing. And this is why he called me to India. So March took place, January took place, and February took place. And in February, there was a big event at the ashram. It was my teacher's birthday. And so Kirpal, people had been initiated to my teacher, came from all over India. There must have been, 10,000 people packed inside this ashram. And then March came and nothing had happened. And all of a sudden, Takar started sending people home. And he didn't send me home. I was scheduled to be there for a year just to work on my own personal development. But I went to him, and I thought, well, this is kind of strange because he said this is going to happen and it never happened. And so I went to him and I said, I've made some plans. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the US. And he said, okay, this is fine. But one of the things that he said in one of the talks before I left, he said that God had changed his mind about this, that he wanted to go ahead and let everyone live in peace, at least for now. So I went back to the US, and when I got back to the US, I had other visions about this. I had a vision where I saw the devil went into the LA Coliseum, and he placed some enormous explosives underneath the LA Coliseum. And then he went up into the stands in the LA Coliseum and just sat there as if he was waiting for something. Now, interestingly enough, in 1984, which is when I returned to the United States, that was a year of the LA Olympics. The Olympics were in LA that year. And so this was in March and April, just a few months before the opening of the LA Olympics. And I was concerned that this destruction that Takar had talked about before in context with the Olympics in 1984. And I was especially concerned because I actually knew some people who were involved in the opening ceremony for the LA Olympics. Nothing happened during the LA Olympics. This was not discussed by anyone after this. It just kind of died on the vine. And I never really had a conversation with anybody about this. This was just this experience that I had, and I didn't know what it was about. In 2005, I saw Takar again. He was in the United States. I went to one of his talks. And again, in 2005, all of a sudden, Takar is again talking about destruction. And I had had other visions a few years earlier where, again, I saw off in the distance, I saw these mushroom clouds. And I didn't have a personal conversation with Takar about this, but I thought it's really curious. He's still talking about destruction. So Takar passed away in 2007. And again, this is just some experience I had. I didn't know anything about it. In 2018, it came to my awareness that a couple of books had been published by two different authors about a very scary, dangerous set of circumstances and events that took place in 1983. They took place in November of 1983. One of these books is called 1983, The World at the Brink. The author is Taylor Downing. The other book is called The Brink, President Reagan and the Nuclear War Scare of 1983 by Mark Ambinder. And what happened was that all of the people in the Soviet Union who knew about this were sworn to secrecy. What happened was the Soviet Union in 1983, in November of 1983, had decided that they were going to have a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States and against all NATO countries. And these two books explain why that took place. I'm not going to, if anybody's interested, they can read the books. I won't go into the details of why they decided they were going to do this. But November, every year, the Soviet Union and now Russia, along with NATO, they have their nuclear exercises, and they have them simultaneously just in case one side is disguising their exercises as being a preemptive strike. And they do this every year in November. And in 1983, the Soviet Union had decided they were going to, in fact, have a preemptive strike. And so eventually, some of the people involved, they were sworn to secrecy in the Soviet Union. They didn't want it out that they had planned to do this. But a couple of the insiders in Andropov's inner circle decided that before they left this world, they needed to come clean and explain to the world what had happened in 1983. So they were interviewed by these two writers, one of them again, Taylor Downing, the other Mark Ambinder, and they explained everything that happened in 1983 and the fact that the Soviet Union had, in fact, decided to have this preemptive nuclear strike and all of the things surrounding it. They never give a clear explanation of why they didn't follow through with this preemptive nuclear strike, but it was decided at the last minute that all of the military people, they went to Andropov's hospital room. Andropov was sick at the time, and somehow they decided not to do this at the last minute. So to get back to my prophecy concerning this, as I said in 1984, I had this vision about the LA Coliseum and the devil planting explosives under the Coliseum. I have been made aware of the fact that this problem on the causal plane has never been satisfied. It's never been resolved, and all of these psychic entities still exist. What I have been informed of is that there's another time frame that this has been scheduled to manifest on the earth. And that time frame is in 2028, more or less corresponding with the time of the LA Olympics. The LA Olympics is going to be held again in Los Angeles in 2028. So I've been informed by my master that this is scheduled again. And my experience with Takar has taught me that just because it's been scheduled doesn't necessarily mean that it will manifest. So that was an important lesson for me to know. And so my revealing this information, this prophecy to you, comes with a caveat that this could be kicked down the road again. So I'm not making a solid prediction here because I can't, because this is in God's hands. But you will see this. You will see this isn't something that will be behind the scenes like it was in 1983. You will see some events that take place in 1983, or excuse me, in 2028, where there's some very great tensions that take place in the world. One of the visions I've had about this, I've had numerous visions about this. One of the visions I had shows an opposing army with these military hats that have very high fronts on them. And the Soviet or Russia has these types of hats. North Korea has these types of hats. China also has these types of hats. So one of those three nations will be involved in this. One of the divisions also showed these military people with these types of hats being eviscerated, being very heavily destroyed. So at any rate, that was my experience. Again, you will see some things in 2028 that will lead up to this. I'm not planning to do anything special. I'm going to store water and store some dried grains and rice, but I don't plan to do any other modifications to my lifestyle or where I live or anything like that.
You mentioned that you knew the exact month, and that you had some other details regarding this prophecy that may or may not come true. Can you talk about that, please?
Well, the LA Olympics is scheduled for 2028. So the LA Olympics starts, I think the opening ceremony is at the end of July or the beginning of August. So you can use those 2 months, July and August of 2028, as the months. I would say at the end of July 2028 is when this will come to a head. And again, it may be resolved and this can may be kicked down the road. World leaders need to take this seriously, and they need to create new psychic entities that are of peace and mutual cooperation and understanding that can fight off these entities that are related to war. This is scheduled for 2028, July or August of 2028. Sometimes in prophecies and precognitive awarenesses, sometimes there's a time factor that can be associated with it, and sometimes there isn't. To give you an example, I had a vision years ago. I was trading in the securities market. I had a vision that the market would rally. I don't know why I had this vision. The market would rally in 103 days. And so when I woke up the next morning, I marked my calendar for 103 days in the future. And sure enough, on that day, the market rallied very strongly for 3 days in a row. So why I had this experience, I have no idea. Sometimes these awarenesses have a date, have a time frame attached to them. Sometimes they don't. This is a nuclear war that can manifest in July or August of 2028. I've seen the mushroom clouds. I've been informed about this through the inner master who resides inside of me. And this is what he's told me. And this is not some technological war or, conventional war. This is a nuclear exchange. If this happens, it'll most certainly involve the United States and NATO, because the United States and NATO are partners. If anyone is threatened by this type of nuclear exchange, whether it's Russia or whether it's North Korea or whether it's China, it's not just the United States. It's at risk. It's all of NATO, which is Europe, which is all of Western Europe. My advice for humanity is that the world leaders have got to take this threat of nuclear war seriously, and they've got to immediately start talks about nuclear disarmament. Russia has been talking about this. You see, here's the thing. This whole problem with nuclear weapons and nuclear war lay dormant for years. The Cold War kind of came to a conclusion, and there was really no nuclear threat. And now we have this situation with this war in Ukraine where Russia is talking about using nuclear weapons. And when they do that, they get the whole world thinking about the threat of nuclear war. And all this does is strengthen these psychic entities on the causal plane. And every time these Russian leaders and these people in the media in Russia, they start talking about, oh, we can use nuclear weapons, and we can flood all of England with a nuclear weapon exploded outside, and they talk about this as if this is something that they can actually do and get away with. And this is very, very dangerous, because now these entities have been awakened again, And now we're scheduled to have this take place. And we've got to reverse this with the way we think and the way we act. And we've got to disarm all this nuclear stuff. These leaders have got to accept the world the way it is. Russia's got to accept national borders. They've agreed to accept these national borders, but they're not living up to it. China needs to respect Taiwan. Taiwan doesn't want to be absorbed by communist China. But China has come out and basically said they're going to attack Taiwan. They're going to do it. The Chinese Xi Jinping has been preparing his population for this. He's been preparing the world for this. Putin bluffs, but Xi Jinping does not bluff. And he's been saying all along, this is coming. He's been preparing his army for war. He's been preparing his people for war. So we've got to accept the world the way it is, and it's with these weapons of mass destruction. This is very dangerous, and we have to turn the tide. And if we don't, even if this doesn't manifest in 2028, if we don't do something about these very dangerous psychic entities, all we're doing is kicking this can down the road again. I mean, in 1984, we kicked the can down the road. The Soviet Union was dissolved. We had detente in the world, and these psychic entities went back to sleep. And now, all of a sudden, Russia has brought up the threat of nuclear war again, and these entities have been revitalized. And this is very, very dangerous. So if we don't do something right now, the next threat time-wise is in July and August of 2028.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.